The early morning sky was still veiled in mist as Captain Marcus Washington stepped onto the Boeing 787 of Transcontinental Airways, preparing for the flight from Newark to Chicago. After 15 years in the industry, having faced all kinds of weather, technical failures, and mid-air emergencies, he never imagined that a single cup of coffee could put his entire career at risk. The warm ceramic cup sat comfortably in his hand, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filling the cockpit. But the moment his lips touched the rim, something felt wrong. A bitter, unnervingly salty taste seeped through each sip, making Marcus pause. Something wasn't right. His eyes flickered over the instrument panel, but his thoughts were already elsewhere. One question hung heavily in his mind. Who had touched his coffee? Beside him, First Officer Liam Riley was focused on the radar screen, oblivious to Marcus's growing unease. The aircraft showed no signs of malfunction. Everything appeared normal. But Marcus's instincts, honed through years of experience, told him otherwise. Something was very wrong on this flight, and it wasn't just about him. It might be tied to a far darker truth that had existed within the aviation industry for far too long. Marcus set the cup down, an unsettling feeling twisting in his gut. He couldn't just ignore the strange taste. His instincts screamed that this wasn't a coincidence, but as a pilot, he knew better than to jump to conclusions without proof. Every decision in the cockpit had to be based on evidence and caution. He stole a glance at Liam Riley, his co-pilot, sitting beside him. Liam remained completely absorbed in the flight systems, running weather checks and reviewing the flight path. His face was relaxed, unaware of the tension quietly building in Marcus. "How's your coffee?" Marcus asked, his voice carefully neutral. Liam took a sip, then raised an eyebrow. "Tastes the same as always. Why?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he scanned the instrument panel again, as if trying to refocus his mind. Technically, the flight was proceeding flawlessly, but the unease lingered. Something was off. His mind drifted back to earlier that morning. 3 hours ago, when he first boarded the plane, he had been in a good mood, still carrying the ease of a short vacation with his family. A week in Barbados, away from the relentless pressure of his job, had been enough to recharge his spirit. But the moment he returned, he felt it. A shift in the air, a subtle but undeniable sense that something was different. At the time, he couldn't name it, but now he knew he couldn't ignore it. As Marcus made his way to the cockpit, he caught Cassandra Whitfield's gaze, the senior flight attendant of Transcontinental Airways. But it wasn't a warm, professional nod like the one she had given Liam. Her eyes barely met his before gliding past him with a cold indifference, as if acknowledging his presence was nothing more than a formality, a duty, rather than an act of genuine respect. Marcus had seen this before. In his 15 years of flying, he had encountered countless moments like this. Subtle, but unmistakable. No one ever said it out loud. No one ever outright disrespected him. But the difference in how he was treated? That was always crystal clear. He had learned to let it go, had learned to work twice as hard just to be recognized on the same level as everyone else. But this time, something felt different. As his gaze swept over the cabin, he noticed a young black woman in seat 3A, her voice sharp with frustration as she spoke to Cassandra. "I told you, this is my seat. I have my ticket right here." "I'm simply verifying the information, ma'am," Cassandra replied, but her tone was colder and sharper than necessary. Marcus stepped out of the cockpit, his voice calm but firm. "Is there a problem here?" The passenger immediately turned to him, her eyes filled with frustration, but also hope. "I've shown her my ticket 3 times, but she keeps insisting that I'm in the wrong seat." Marcus glanced at the phone in her hand. Seat 3A. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. Marcus gave a small nod. "She's correct. Thank you for your patience, ma'am. Welcome aboard Transcontinental Airways." Cassandra hesitated, then stiffly nodded. "Apologies for the confusion," she said, but there was no warmth, no sincerity in her voice. Marcus had seen this too many times before. These so-called misunderstandings always seemed to happen to passengers who looked like him. He couldn't prove it was discrimination, but he knew, he felt it. And then, now, with the strange-tasting coffee in front of him, Marcus began to realize something. Maybe this wasn't just cold indifference or subtle bias. Maybe this time, it was something far worse. Marcus set the coffee cup down, but the unease in his chest remained. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, not without proof. But every small detail from this morning was beginning to piece together into an unsettling picture. He stole another glance at Liam, who was still focused on the flight instruments, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside Marcus's mind. Maybe he should let it go. Move on. Do his job, as always. But then, his eyes drifted toward seat 3A, toward the woman Cassandra had tried to displace before takeoff. And suddenly, ignoring it didn't seem like an option anymore. She sat upright in her seat, but the traces of frustration still lingered on her face. Her fingers curled slightly around the armrest, as if she was still processing what had just happened. Marcus replayed the moment in his mind. It had only been an hour ago. At the time, the cabin was still buzzing with passengers settling into their seats. Marcus had just stepped out of the cockpit for a quick scan of the cabin when he heard Cassandra Whitfield's sharp voice in first class. "I told you, ma'am. This is not your seat. Can you show me your ticket again?" Marcus stopped in his tracks. He saw her, a young black woman, no older than 27 or 28, dressed in a sleek business suit, holding her phone tightly in her hand as she raised it toward Cassandra for the third time. "Seat 3A. This is my ticket. You've already checked it twice. I just need to verify the information again," Cassandra insisted, but there was something different about her demeanor, something that Marcus had seen before. He had flown too many flights not to recognize it. He had witnessed this exact scenario before, this kind of mistake that always seemed to happen to passengers of color. A silent form of discrimination, too subtle to be called out directly, but too obvious for those who had experienced it before. Not wanting the situation to escalate further, Marcus stepped in. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. The passenger turned to him, her eyes filled with both frustration and hope, as if finally someone was listening. "I've told her this is my seat, but she keeps checking my ticket over and over again." Marcus glanced at the phone screen. Seat 3A. She was right. He turned to Cassandra, keeping his voice level but unwavering. "This passenger is assigned to seat 3A. I believe she has confirmed that enough times." A flicker of tension passed over Cassandra's face. But then, after a brief hesitation, she stepped back. "Apologies for the mix-up," she said, but her tone was stiff, forced, lacking sincerity. Marcus said nothing more. Instead, he simply turned to the passenger and gave a slight nod. "Thank you for your patience, ma'am. I hope you have a pleasant flight." She offered a faint smile as if to say thank you before settling into her seat. But Marcus knew. That feeling, the sting of being treated differently, didn't just disappear after a half-hearted apology. Back in the cockpit, Marcus let out a slow breath. This wasn't something they taught in training manuals. It wasn't like mechanical failures, which had clear procedures to fix them. This was deeper, more ingrained, more persistent. Something that had existed long before he joined the industry. And now, with the strange-tasting coffee sitting in front of him, he couldn't help but wonder, was this just about a passenger being unfairly treated? Or had this bias finally reached all the way into the cockpit itself? Marcus leaned back in his seat, letting the familiar warmth of the cockpit surround him. The hum of the engines vibrated through the enclosed space, blending with the soft blinking of the instrument panel. But despite the comfort of familiarity, something was off. The bitter, lingering taste on his tongue. He didn't take another sip. The cup sat there, untouched on the side panel, a silent question left unanswered. Liam, still unaware of the storm of thoughts brewing in Marcus's mind, remained focused on the flight instruments. His voice was steady as he spoke into the radio. "Transcontinental 247, maintaining 35,000 feet, continuing to Chicago, conditions stable. No technical issues. No mechanical problems. By all official standards, this flight was running flawlessly. Except for one thing." Marcus couldn't ignore it anymore. He reached for the cup again, bringing it close to his nose. The aroma was normal. A thin layer of foam still lingered on top, making it look like any other cup of coffee he had ever had. But when he took a small sip, the sharp, salty bitterness returned instantly. Something was in it. Marcus had flown thousands of flights, had drunk coffee from countless airline brews. He knew what stale coffee tasted like. This wasn't that. It wasn't just a bad batch. It wasn't a machine malfunction. This was something else. He set the cup down carefully this time, eyes still fixed straight ahead. But in his mind, he was already piecing everything together. Cassandra's cold, indifferent gaze when he first boarded the plane. The way she deliberately gave the black passenger in seat 3A a hard time. The brief hesitation on Vanessa's face, the new flight attendant, when he casually asked how she was adjusting to the job. Each small detail was now fitting into a troubling picture. Marcus took a deep breath, steadying himself. This wasn't just a cup of coffee with an odd taste. This could be deliberate. His eyes swept across the cabin beyond the cockpit doors. The passengers remained seated, oblivious to anything unusual. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, carrying out their duties, as if it were just another routine flight. Everything looked normal, but normal didn't always mean safe. Marcus pressed the crew call button. A few seconds later, Jessica Chen, the first-class lead flight attendant, appeared at the cockpit door. "Captain, what do you need?" Her voice was as professional as always, but Marcus didn't miss the quick flick of her eyes toward the cup of coffee sitting on the side panel. Keeping his voice steady, he asked, "Jessica, who poured this coffee for me?" Jessica blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "I'm not sure. When I came into the cockpit earlier, no one was here, but..." She hesitated. Marcus leaned in slightly. "But what?" Jessica bit her lip, then lowered her voice. "When you stepped out to check the cabin, I saw Cassandra near this area. I assumed she was just reviewing the meal count, but..." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Cassandra. There was no reason for her to be inside the cockpit. None at all. And now, with this cup of coffee in front of him, the real question wasn't just who poured it, but why it tasted the way it did. Keeping his voice measured, he nodded. "Thank you, Jessica. Let's keep this between us for now, okay?" Jessica gave a small nod, but he could see the worry in her expression before she stepped back and disappeared into the cabin. As the cockpit door sealed shut behind her, Marcus turned to Liam, who had been silent throughout the exchange, observing every detail. "Liam, do you remember Cassandra coming in while I was out?" Liam hesitated, then slowly nodded. "Yeah, she said she needed to update the meal count for Chicago. But now that I think about it, it was kind of odd. I didn't see her touch anything, but I wasn't exactly watching closely either." Marcus clenched his jaw. He didn't want to jump to accusations without proof, but everything was pointing in one direction. His gaze dropped back to the coffee cup. A pilot being poisoned mid-flight. This wasn't just personal. This was a direct threat to flight safety. Marcus took another deep breath. He couldn't let this go, and this time, he was going to find out the truth. Marcus pushed the cup further away, keeping it out of reach, as if touching it again would turn his suspicions into an undeniable reality. Liam rested his elbows on the control panel, eyes locked on Marcus. "You really think there's something in there?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared out of the cockpit window, where the sky stretched endlessly before them, a vast, undisturbed blue. The plane glided smoothly through the clouds, and behind the reinforced doors, the passengers sat unaware, lost in their own quiet journeys. But inside this small space between him and Liam, a truth was unraveling, and it wasn't nearly as peaceful as the sky beyond. Finally, Marcus spoke. His voice was calm, certain. "I don't think I know." Liam stiffened, taking in the weight of those words. Then, after a moment of silence, he asked the inevitable. "What do we do now, Captain?" Marcus couldn't jump to conclusions publicly. This was a commercial flight carrying over 200 people. One wrong move, and the situation could spiral out of control. He needed to be absolutely sure. Marcus pressed the crew call button again. Within seconds, Daniel Rodriguez appeared at the cockpit door. "Do you need something, Captain?" Marcus didn't turn around immediately. He kept his gaze fixed on the sky outside the cockpit window, deliberately letting the silence stretch for a few moments before responding. "Daniel, I need to ask you about the coffee service on this flight." Daniel raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the question. "Of course. What do you need to know?" Marcus's voice remained steady. "Who was responsible for serving coffee to the flight crew today?" Daniel hesitated for a brief moment. "We don't have a designated person. But..." He trailed off, his eyes flickering toward the cup of coffee sitting in front of Marcus. Marcus leaned forward slightly, his tone calm but his gaze sharp. But what? Daniel took a slow breath. I don't want to cause trouble for anyone, but I saw Cassandra near the galley right before Jessica brought the coffee to the cockpit. I didn't think much of it at the time, but since you're asking. Marcus felt a tightness in his chest. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. The pieces were forming a disturbing picture. He gave a slow nod. Thank you, Daniel. Can you keep this to yourself for now? Daniel hesitated, but then nodded. Of course, Captain. As the cockpit door clicked shut, Marcus turned to Liam, his mind racing. Cassandra was the last person near the coffee station, and you saw her enter the cockpit while I was gone. Liam swallowed hard, the weight of the situation dawning on him. What do you think she did to it? Marcus clenched his jaw. I don't know for sure, but I'm gonna find out. If this was deliberate, it wasn't just a cruel joke or an act of defiance. It was a direct safety threat. And if Cassandra thought Marcus was going to ignore it, she had made a grave miscalculation. He pressed the intercom button again. Vanessa, meet me in the aft galley. I need to speak with you immediately. Marcus removed his headset, stood up from his seat, and opened the cockpit door. The roar of the engines filled the background, but to Marcus, it was nothing more than a backdrop to the storm brewing inside him. He walked briskly down the aisle, maintaining a controlled pace despite the tension churning in his chest. The passengers remained oblivious, immersed in work, movies, or quiet conversations, completely unaware that a confrontation was about to unfold at 35,000 feet. When Marcus reached the rear galley, he spotted Vanessa Miller, the new flight attendant, carefully stacking plastic cups. She looked up when she saw him and worry flashed in her eyes. Captain, you wanted to see me? Marcus nodded, his voice even but firm. Can we talk privately for a moment? Vanessa hesitated, glancing nervously around the galley. Then her eyes flickered toward Cassandra, who stood a few feet away, pretending to be busy with the meal service checklist. Marcus caught that quick glance, the fleeting hesitation. She knew something, and she was afraid to say it. He lowered his voice. I know this isn't easy, but I need you to be honest with me. What happened before Jessica brought the coffee to the cockpit? Vanessa swallowed hard, her fingers knotting together in front of her. Captain, I don't want to cause any problems. Marcus held her gaze, steady and unwavering. If something affects the safety of this flight, it's no longer a personal issue. It's our shared responsibility. Vanessa took a deep breath, her eyes flickering between fear and hesitation. Finally, she looked at Marcus and, after a brief pause, lowered her voice cautiously. I didn't see her do anything to the coffee directly, but I did see Cassandra standing there right before Jessica came to get it. And Marcus waited. He didn't interrupt. And I overheard her talking to Daniel earlier. Vanessa hesitated, her brows knitting together in uncertainty. Marcus's voice dropped lower. What did she say? Vanessa swallowed hard, then almost whispered. She said, some people don't know their place, and sometimes they need to be taught a lesson. The air seemed to freeze. A cold anger spread through Marcus, but his face remained unreadable. He had heard words like this too many times before in his career. But this time, it wasn't just words, it had become action. Vanessa studied his face carefully, worry creeping into her expression. Captain, do you think she actually did something to your coffee? Marcus didn't answer right away. He inhaled slowly, his eyes locking onto Vanessa's. I'm going to find out. Vanessa nodded slowly. Do you want me to do anything? Marcus's gaze flicked over to Cassandra, who was still pretending to be occupied with her checklist, acting as if she had no idea what was unfolding around her. But Marcus had seen it. He knew. It was time to confront her. Keep working as usual. Don't look nervous. I'll handle this. Vanessa gave a quick nod and stepped back, resuming her duties as if nothing had happened. Marcus turned and walked straight toward Cassandra. There was no more doubt now. It was time for answers. Cassandra looked up just as Marcus approached. For the briefest second, her eyes flickered. Not in surprise, but in calculation. She blinked, as if not expecting him to come to her so quickly. Captain, is there a problem? Her voice remained professional, but Marcus caught the subtle tension behind it. He stood calmly in front of her, his voice low and steady, but carrying an unmistakable weight. I have a simple question, Cassandra. She blinked again, trying to keep her composure. Go ahead. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. Did you touch my coffee? The air grew thick with silence. Cassandra didn't flinch, but the pause in her breath, the flicker in her eyes, told Marcus everything he needed to know. She was calculating her response, weighing her options. Finally, she spoke, her tone measured. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Captain." Marcus didn't blink. His voice remained calm but heavy with meaning. "I'm asking a very straightforward question, Cassandra. Did you touch my coffee?" Cassandra blinked again, longer this time. And in that moment, Marcus knew her confidence was starting to crack. She squared her shoulders. "I was simply doing my job. If there's an issue with the coffee, maybe the machine is faulty, not me." Marcus narrowed his gaze, watching every tiny shift in her expression, every micro-reaction, every small sign of deception. "Fair enough," he said smoothly. "Then I'm sure you won't mind if I hold on to this cup and have it tested when we land?" Cassandra froze for just a fraction of a second. And in that single moment, Marcus saw everything he needed to see. She panicked. For just a heartbeat, her eyes darkened. Her mouth twitched ever so slightly. Then, just as quickly, she tried to mask it, forcing her expression back to neutrality. But it was too late. Marcus had already seen the truth. But Marcus had seen it. She couldn't hide the truth anymore. Cassandra lifted her chin slightly, her voice turning icy. "You're blowing this way out of proportion, Captain." Marcus didn't blink. "Or maybe I'm heading in exactly the right direction." Cassandra pressed her lips together, saying nothing. But her silence said everything. Marcus had no doubts now. Cassandra had done something to his coffee, and now it was time to bring it to light. The air between them froze. Cassandra stood her ground, chin raised, trying to feign indifference, but the faint twitch at the corner of her mouth betrayed her. Marcus didn't rush. His gaze locked onto hers, his voice steady, sharp as a blade. "I'll ask one last time, Cassandra. Did you touch my coffee?" A hesitation, a long blink, and then a laugh. Not a genuine one, a hollow, humorless chuckle. "This is ridiculous, Captain. Do you seriously think I would do something to your coffee?" Marcus's expression didn't change. "I don't think. I know." The tension thickened, so heavy it felt like the air itself could be sliced in two. Cassandra was starting to feel the pressure. Her eyes darted around, as if searching for an escape from this confrontation. But Marcus wasn't letting her go. "Only one person was near my coffee while I was out of the cockpit, and that was you. You can keep denying it, but I have witnesses. And this cup of coffee, it'll be tested the moment we land." For the first time, Cassandra visibly cracked. Her breaths became shallower, her eyes flashing with anger and something close to panic. "You're making this into what exactly? A criminal investigation?" she snapped. "What did I do, huh? If your coffee tastes bad, that's a machine issue, not mine." Marcus gave a slow nod, but his eyes never left her. "Then you won't mind if I hand this cup over to security in Chicago for testing, will you?" Cassandra froze, completely. For a second that stretched like an eternity, she stood there motionless. Then, a smirk. A bitter, twisted smirk. A sarcastic, hollow smile creeping onto her lips. "Oh, you're really serious about this, aren't you?" Her voice dropped to a whisper, so low only Marcus could hear. She took a slow step closer, lowering her tone to something almost conspiratorial. "So what if I did? A little spit in your coffee never killed anyone, did it, Captain?" Marcus felt his entire body tense. Not from disgust, but from the sheer ugliness of the truth staring back at him. She had just admitted it. Cassandra had done it on purpose. Not just as an act of defiance, as an act of humiliation. And worse, she found it amusing. Marcus held his gaze steady, but this time, there was no more doubt. Only a deep, cutting silence. He had met people like Cassandra before. People who hated him for the color of his skin, but hid their contempt behind fake smiles. But Cassandra had gone further than anyone before her. She didn't just harbor hatred in silence. She acted on it. Cassandra stared at Marcus, as if waiting for a furious reaction. But Marcus didn't give her that satisfaction. He didn't flinch, didn't waver, didn't give her an inch. "Thank you for your honesty, Miss Whitfield." His voice dropped to a dangerously low tone, calm but loaded with meaning. Cassandra narrowed her eyes, surprised by his lack of visible anger. "And what are you going to do about it, Captain? Report me? You think the airline is going to take your side?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a single step back, gave her a small nod and said, "We'll find out soon enough." And then, Right in front of her, without hesitation, he pressed the intercom button. "First Officer Riley, contact Chicago Airport Security. Upon landing, I want a security team on board immediately." Cassandra's face drained of color. For the first time all flight, she lost complete control. "You can't be serious. Over a cup of coffee?" she snapped, her voice breaking, but it was already too late. Marcus met her eyes directly. His voice didn't waver. "This isn't about coffee. It's about what you did. You made yourself a threat to this flight." Cassandra sucked in a sharp breath as if about to argue. But then, she realized, every eye in the galley was locked onto her. Jessica, Daniel, Vanessa. They had all seen it unfold. There was no way out now. Cassandra blinked rapidly, struggling to form a response, but no words came. And as Marcus turned and walked back toward the cockpit, she knew. The game was over. When this plane landed, there would no longer be a Miss Whitfield on any flight. Ever again. Cassandra stood frozen, her entire body rigid. She knew she had slipped up. She knew she had exposed her true nature. But what she hadn't expected was for Marcus to act immediately, without hesitation, without giving her a single escape route. The cabin remained quiet, aside from the gentle hum of passenger conversations and the steady roar of the engines. But for Marcus, everything had shifted. One battle was over, another was just beginning. He returned to the cockpit without another word to Cassandra. He didn't need to say anything. His actions would speak for him. As the cockpit door locked shut behind him, Liam turned toward Marcus, his expression tense. "Did she just admit it?" Marcus nodded slowly. Not only did she admit it, she wasn't even sorry. Liam let out a sharp breath, his grip tightening around the flight controls. "I can't believe this." Marcus took a deep breath, refocusing on the flight instruments. "We still have a plane to land, Liam. Let's make sure we get everyone down safely. Then we'll deal with the rest." Liam nodded, but the frustration was still clear on his face. "I've flown with Cassandra for years. I never would have thought she was capable of this." Marcus wasn't surprised. "You weren't the one she was targeting. Sometimes you don't see a person's true nature until you're the one standing in their way." Liam fell silent, absorbing Marcus's words. An hour later, the plane began its descent toward Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Marcus reached for the intercom, his voice steady and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Washington. We are beginning our final descent into Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The current weather is 72 degrees Fahrenheit with clear skies. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until the aircraft has come to a complete stop. Thank you for flying with Transcontinental Airways." To the passengers, it was just another routine landing. To Marcus, it was the beginning of the end. Touchdown. Judgment hour. As the plane touched down, Marcus glanced out the cockpit window. Just as he had expected, airport security was waiting. Two uniformed officers stood near the gate entrance, their eyes locked onto the aircraft. Marcus felt a cold sense of relief settle over him. "This ends here," Liam muttered under his breath. "They're here." Marcus gave a firm nod. "You handle post-flight checks. I'll take care of this." As the plane came to a full stop and the main cabin doors opened, passengers began disembarking as usual. Everything seemed normal. Until, as the last few passengers made their way off the plane, the two security officers stepped inside. Jessica, already aware of the situation, met Marcus's gaze and gave him a small nod, a silent confirmation that he was doing the right thing. Marcus stepped out of the cockpit. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look away. He met Cassandra's eyes directly, and in a voice as calm as it was final, he said, "Miss Whitfield, please come with them." Marcus didn't waver. "This isn't about coffee, Cassandra. It's about what you did, what you admitted to." Cassandra's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag, her jaw clenched, but there was nowhere left to run. "You're all going to regret this." Her voice was full of resentment, but it no longer held any power. One of the security officers stepped forward. "Miss Whitfield, please cooperate. If you refuse, we will have to escort you by force." A beat of silence. Cassandra's grip on her bag tightened even more. Then, she tossed her hair back, as if desperately clinging to the last remnants of her pride. But it was over. The moment she stepped off this plane, she was no longer Cassandra Whitfield, senior flight attendant. She was just another disgraced employee, about to disappear into the crowd. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the exit, her heels clicking against the floor. 2 security officers flanked her, escorting her down the jet bridge, and as she descended the steps onto the tarmac, she was swallowed by the airport crowd. And just like that, Cassandra Whitfield was gone from the skies. Marcus stood at the entrance of the aircraft, watching until she was out of sight. Jessica stepped beside him, her voice low but firm. "You did the right thing, Captain." Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a deep breath and felt the weight in the air finally lift. He hadn't wanted this to happen, but if given the choice again, he would do the exact same thing. Turning back, Marcus stepped into the cockpit, where Liam was waiting. "It's done?" Liam asked. Marcus gave a small nod. "It's done." But the truth was, this story wasn't over yet. Something was about to change, not just for Marcus, but for the entire aviation industry. Marcus stood in the cockpit, his gaze fixed on the world outside the window. On the tarmac below, Cassandra was being escorted away, each step she took dragging behind the remnants of an outdated, decaying system. A system that should have been dismantled long ago. Liam let out a long breath, sinking into his seat, as if only now allowing himself to process the tension of the past few hours. "I still can't believe this actually happened." Marcus turned back, resting a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Believe it or not, it did. And it's not over." Liam frowned. "What do you mean?" Marcus removed his headset, disconnecting from air traffic control. He already knew this wouldn't end with Cassandra simply being escorted off the plane. There would be investigations, there would be accusations, there would be attempts to bury the truth. And Marcus wasn't going to let that happen. Less than an hour after landing, Marcus and Liam were summoned to Transcontinental Airways' corporate office at Chicago O'Hare Airport. Inside a small conference room, 2 men awaited them: Regina Howard, Chicago's regional HR director; James Mercer, Northeast chief pilot. Regina straightened the stack of files on the table, her face betraying zero surprise, as if she had known something like this would happen sooner or later. James, however, looked completely different. He leaned back in his chair, chest rising and falling heavily, like he had just sprinted to the meeting. "Marcus." James spoke first, his voice heavy with gravity. "I've read the reports. Can you explain what happened on your flight?" Marcus didn't hesitate. He recounted everything, every detail. From Cassandra's treatment of the black passenger in seat 3A, to the strange taste of his coffee, to the confrontation in the galley, and finally, to Cassandra's shocking confession. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody looked surprised. And that was what bothered Marcus the most. When he finished, Regina exhaled, folding her hands on the table. "Miss Whitfield has been placed on immediate suspension," she stated slowly. "But we need to conduct a full investigation before taking permanent action." Marcus leaned forward. His voice was calm but unwavering. "I don't care about internal processes. I care about the safety of my crew and my passengers. What she did wasn't just unethical. It was a violation of federal aviation safety laws." James nodded, his expression hardened. "I agree. Her actions could warrant criminal charges." Regina remained stone-faced. "We'll be working with the FAA on this matter. But you both need to understand something." She turned to Marcus, her eyes flashing with a silent warning. "This story cannot leak to the public." Silence. Liam glanced at Marcus. Marcus didn't break eye contact with Regina. Because this was how the industry had always worked. Burying the truth, protecting the company's image. Marcus let out a cold, quiet laugh. "If you think I'm going to stay silent, you've miscalculated." Regina's jaw tightened. "We're not asking you to stay silent, Captain Washington. We just want to ensure this is handled professionally, not turned into a media scandal." Marcus tilted his head slightly. His voice was calm, unshaken, absolute. "If the company actually intends to handle this properly, I won't need to speak to anyone else." Regina stared at him for a long moment, then finally exhaled. "Good." James laced his fingers together and nodded. "I assure you, we won't let this get swept under the rug." Marcus held his gaze for a long moment, then finally he nodded. "I hope so." 2 days later, Transcontinental Airways officially terminated Cassandra Whitfield. The company's internal report concluded that she had severely violated professional ethics and aviation safety regulations. But that was only the tip of the iceberg. Marcus received an anonymous email from a former employee. It revealed that there had been multiple complaints about Cassandra's behavior over the years. all ignored, all buried. And that was the final straw. This time, Marcus didn't stay silent. He reached out to aviation media. He shared his story openly, professionally, but without sugarcoating the truth. And it didn't take long for the story to spread like wildfire. It became a major talking point across aviation forums, industry conferences, and employee discussions. Then, the FAA launched a full investigation, not just into Cassandra's actions, but into Transcontinental Airways' internal handling of complaints. And the system began to shift. Marcus and his new role. 3 weeks later, the CEO of Transcontinental Airways personally reached out to Marcus. "You've stirred up a storm in this industry, Captain Washington." Marcus didn't smile. "A necessary storm." The CEO exhaled deeply. "We're forming an advisory board on aviation safety and diversity. I want you on it." Marcus paused for a beat. He had never wanted to be a symbol. He had only ever wanted to do his job. But then, he thought about Cassandra. He thought about the black passenger in seat 3A. He thought about the young pilots who would face the same struggles unless someone spoke up. Marcus nodded. "I'm in, but under one condition." The CEO raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" Marcus's jaw tightened. His gaze was sharper than ever. "This cannot be just a PR move. We need real change." And this time, he was going to make sure it happened. 3 months later, a new flight, a new industry. 3 months after the Cassandra Whitfield incident, Marcus Washington sat in the cockpit. His hand rested on the throttle of a Boeing 787, ready for takeoff. He was still a pilot. Still doing the job he had loved since he was a kid, watching planes take off from Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. But everything had changed, not just for him, but for the entire industry. Transcontinental Airways rolled out new policies. Stronger ethics training for all employees. A revamped complaint system to prevent cases from being buried. A commitment that no employee would ever have to silently endure discrimination again. And the FAA took action too. Following Marcus's reports, they expanded their investigation and introduced new federal safety and equity standards for the entire commercial aviation sector. These changes wouldn't fix everything overnight. But Marcus knew one thing for sure. No one should have to experience what he did. And he had done the right thing. The day before this flight, Marcus received a letter. It wasn't from an airline executive or a government official. It was from a young woman named Tasha Williams. "Captain Washington," she wrote, "you don't know me, but your story has inspired me. I've always dreamed of becoming a pilot, but I was afraid I would never be accepted. When I heard what you did, I realized I don't have to be afraid anymore. I can chase my dream. Thank you for paving the way for people like me." Marcus folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket. He looked out at the vast sky ahead, the engines roaring to life, signaling it was time for takeoff. He smiled. He used to believe that the sky belonged only to those who knew how to fly. But now, he understood. The sky is only truly open when everyone has the same opportunity to reach it. And so he would keep flying, not just for himself, but for those who would come after him. Because the fight for equality doesn't happen in grand battles. It happens in small moments, a quiet insult ignored, a silent act that makes someone feel like they don't belong. But Marcus hadn't stayed silent. He had stood up. And because he did, everything changed. Have you ever witnessed injustice and didn't know what to do? Remember, every small action matters. One word, one voice, one decision to not look away can create change. If this story made you think, if you believe everyone deserves to be treated fairly, like this video so more people can hear Marcus's story. Share this video, because someone out there might need to hear this today. And don't forget to subscribe to Aiva Stories, so you never miss another inspiring story. Because one story can change a life. And who knows, the next story might just be yours.